UN people were trained in a very specialized way as individuals. In fact, you can say that almost about every staff leader you find in the UN, that they were selected among the best. They were achievers, but Lone Ranger achievers, almost in constant competition with everyone else. When the leaders in the UN, somehow with the invitation we made, plucked some bit of courage to include in the learning process people from other sectors. When we first began working with the UN, they opened up, but they didn't want, when we suggested that they learn together with their stakeholders, the governments they serve in each country, the civil society organizations, businesses, young people, and women. When they ventured into that, and we introduced what for you and I and many people in this call would now consider basic capabilities, what Arawana introduced us to stop, slow down, instead of responding to disruption and speed with speed, doing the opposite, finding time to slow down. Inviting them to be intentional at what level they paid attention or listened. What we heard in that short video was almost as natural as breathing, when they allowed themselves to attend to the environment around them differently. So the fear I talked about in the beginning, Emma, comes from something very genuine, and it looks very normal. Like many of us, UN people were trained in a very specialized way as individuals. In fact, you can say that almost about every staff leader you find in the UN, that they were selected among the best. They were achievers, but Lone Ranger achievers, almost in constant competition with everyone else. During the Leadership Lab, we invited them to operate from a different perspective, to see themselves as stakeholders in a larger, deeper world. We invited them to work on their collective awareness, purely because the disruption we face, the challenges we are confronting, have very little respect for individual prowess. We all pale in the face of the critical challenges we face as humanity. We invited them to experiment with collective action. We asked them within the program itself and in the experiments that they did thereafter to see quality of relationships as one anchor on which they could ride in order to stand a chance of seeing the great opportunities that come with disruption. In a small example, Emma, when my colleague Julie and I were working and supporting the UN team in Bhutan, and the local leadership agreed to bring in representatives to learn with from civil society, from government and from business. In the first place, it was the partners who showed immense surprise that the UN could invite them to their own learning journey. But the UN also did not hold back when in a humanitarian country situation like Bhutan, the local communities, the local NGOs began to talk about solutions and new ways of preparedness in case of emergencies. It was like they were attending to a new country, new possibilities and new solutions. If there is any one thing that I remember which stood out was almost in all cases where we worked, when we invited them to value, and this comes from Arawana's teaching, not knowing has currency. Asking people whose PhDs and professorships and all qualifications are dependent on knowing, you are almost inviting them to do the impossible. But when they plucked enough courage to step into not knowing, then a whole new world of possibilities opened up. Then they could search together. The young people became a source of knowledge. In certain areas, like in Malawi, where we began the journey, my colleague Susanna and I began to see, even when we were doing this online, the UN professionals, highly qualified men and women in the traditional sense of qualification, holding on to every word that this 22-year-old person was saying, because they had been invited to be part of the journey. Let me stop there, Emma, and hear if you have any question or comment, or just for us to chat.
Thank you so much, Martin. And I just want to say, viewing our chat, I want to bring in a comment. Someone in the chat, Ray, says, this points a finger at all our conceptions and ideas about what leadership is. And I think your emphasis on not knowing, and the pieces in the chat that point to maybe the sadness and the pain that also community holds. I wonder if we could, just quickly, what have you learned about how leadership can address those feelings by listening, by sensing into what the community is really holding?
Just quickly, Emma, maybe to something you referred to in the beginning as part of my leader experiences, when I had the privilege of serving my country through the head of state's office. By then, I had begun working with the presencing way of supporting and leading those already in leadership. I invited my head of state to free himself from being the source of wisdom and ideas. And I remember at a lunchtime discussion I had with him, said, then why am I head of state? And I said, sir, it is not because you know everything. We also know you don't know everything. We are hoping that you could use this powerful office, which comes from history, will continue beyond you, to try and convene the nation in small and large numbers to think together. You are like a conductor of an orchestra, paying attention, listening, and allowing that beautiful sound at the end called our lives together to come through, not because you had answers, but because you held the space in which different forms of brilliance, giftedness, knowledge, and experience found their space. Yours is not to know.